Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Turner. I'm the MD here at Risk New Zealand. Welcome to this November 2022 Lunchtime seminar. I would like to thank and acknowledge the support of Risk New Zealand sponsors who make this possible. That's CAMS, Protec, Aon, LexisNexis, SIA Global, Insurance Business New Zealand, and F24. All participants today have been put on mute, but please feel free to type questions straight into the Q&A panel anytime during the session. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So now on to today's exciting topic, which I've been looking forward to, and I know all of you have as well. Compliance, risk management, and training. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you all to presenter Julian Fenwick. Julian is the Managing Director and founder of Governance Risk and Compliance Solutions, a leading online compliance training company in the APAC region, so the APAC region. He's also a regular presenter in Australia and Asia on innovation, entrepreneurship, RegTech, and managing organisational compliance. He's an enthusiastic supporter of the Australian startup community with a particular interest in adaptive e-learning technology. Great to have you here, Julian. Please take it away.
Great, thanks, David. We've got a pretty heavy agenda to get through today, and really what I wanted to do is take us through what we're seeing as far as themes within the standards and the guidance that we're getting from multiple areas. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge country, which is something that we are doing increasingly in Australia, and I think it's really important given where we come from and our history and the history of our Indigenous people in this land. Today, I'm speaking to you from Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. And I'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present and emerging. And we wish to extend that respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and First Nations people with us here today. To me, that is a very important thing to do as we acknowledge where we sit within the Australian community. And increasingly, I think it's something we should be very proud of. So thank you for being with me today. Our agenda is pretty packed. We're going to go through a series of slides looking at what's changed in the compliance standard as we've moved from ASNZ 3806 into 19600 to the recent release of the ISO standard 37301 on compliance risk management systems. And I'd also like to discuss some of the other frameworks and guidance that we're getting from areas such as the Department of Justice in the US and a few other bodies that have given us similar guidance. What I think you'll see is that there is a set of themes that are running through all of that guidance, which I think will be appropriate in all markets, whether you're in New Zealand, Australia, up into the Asia Pacific region, and so on. What we're seeing is a pretty uniform response from regulators into what their expectations are around compliance. So let's get right into it. And I guess the biggest question we need to be asking ourselves is, really, why do we want to comply? And having been in this industry for a bit over 20 years, I go back to something I studied in the 90s, which was a great book written by a couple of Stanford University professors called Built to Last. And what they did was look at organizational resilience. What was it that made an enduring organization? What are the factors that go into it? And this is well before the advent of ESG or CSR or whatever it may have been. What they did is they analyzed what they thought were, really visionary companies who had great environments in which they built creative and inclusive cultures, respectful cultures within their organizations, and built out businesses that were built to last. They stayed in business and they outperformed their comparator companies 6-1. So the return on a dollar of investment from these organizations was significantly higher. And in that process, they also identified a number of myths. And if you do get a chance to pick up this book and have a flick through it, it's been around for over 30 years. I think the 10th edition is now out, but well worth having a look at. And I'll discuss some of those myths as we go through, particularly around, what makes a visionary company and how we build those inclusive and respectful organizations. I know it's a little bit hard to read the Credo that is there on the right of the screen, but I would like to point out that, you know, a lot of the discussions that we're talking about today about involving stakeholders, particularly external stakeholders around governments and regulatory bodies and talking to our customers and contractors and third parties and so on, it's not really a new idea. And this Credo was written by R.W. Johnson Jr. in 1943. And in it, he talks about who the organization has a responsibility to. He talks about the patients, the doctors, the nurses, the mothers and the fathers who use their products. He talks about building respectful and inclusive work environments for employees. He talks about the company's position in the community. And lastly, and he deliberately put it last, is the final responsibility is to the shareholders to build business that makes a sound profit and gives those shareholders a fair return. And he's chosen those words very, very carefully, the idea of a fair return. It's not an excessive return. It's not a startup company that's going to be, you know, worth 10 times its value in 18 months and then be sold on and sold on and sold on and so on. And it's not a company that's going to explode overnight. It is something that will be in business for many, many years to come. So look, I know that's a little bit hard to read, but I've put the web address there on the bottom of the screen, and we will be sharing these slides afterwards, so you will have access to those resources. But I did just really want to point out that, you know, we're not working in something that's totally new. These ideas around our position, our organization's position in the economy have been around for a long time. And when Collins and Porras, you know, revisited some of their research, they found that the characteristics that were visible within those visionary companies, as they called them, were also applicable to other organizations, whether they be schools or universities or charities or hospitals. Those organizations that had that organizational resilience exhibited a certain characteristics and certain frameworks that were consistent across the board. And they weren't necessarily organizations that had the biggest and best idea. They weren't necessarily the organizations who had some, you know, cult-like visionary leader. They were organizations that had decent frameworks in which to do business, that tested out ideas, that kept on continually improving product and moving their business forward in an incremental way. So how does that fold into what we're talking about with regard to the standards? And I wanted to, you know, highlight that the new ISO standard is out and available now, and you can buy that from, I think SAI Global would have a copy of it, and other standards organizations would have a copy of it. And really, it's an evolution. Australia and New Zealand were probably at the forefront of this idea of having a standard for compliance, in that we had the ASNZ 3806 standard to start with, and that was available from the late 90s and into, I think, up until 2000s and so on, before it became an ISO standard, with a lot of work from people, compliance professionals in the Southern Hemisphere, working to convince the ISO that we needed a global standard. The standards all follow a pretty, you know, rudimentary sort of framework of commitment and implementation, through to monitoring and measuring, and then continuous improvement. And I think that that's something that's been maintained throughout the changes to the standards that we're seeing, and now into the new standard. So one of the objectives of this standard is to assist organizations to develop themselves and build out that resilience, improving that business opportunity and sustainability, but also looking at their reputation and credibility within the environment that they work in. And this is something that will come into force, particularly with the ISO standard being an accreditation standard. And I'll get to that shortly. But I think the importance here is that we're looking at how do we communicate that brand essence? How do we say that we are a compliant organization to people who may never have dealt with us before? And that brand issue, I think, is increasingly important as we work in a very much global economy. Partners and colleagues and clients and employees are all going to be looking for what is the framework in which our organizations operate, and how can we be assured that these organizations are more credible than the next. So that's really the point of moving the standard across into an accreditation standard. It's minimizing that reputational damage, but also creating some credibility within the environment in which we're working. The standard works along the same sort of framework of that we've done throughout 19600 and into the new standard of plan, do, check, and act. We've set out the objectives around integrity and culture and building conformity and reputational risk, understand the principles under which we operate, and then build out the organization structures along its legal, social, cultural, and other frameworks that we need to operate in. The new standard, however, is designed to be accredited, and this could well be a burden for organizations who find that there is an increasing demand from perhaps government bodies who want to contract with us, or other organizations who say, look, happy to do business with you, but can you please certify that you comply with ISO 37301, similar to other compliance requirements across ISO standards. The issue for that may well be that there is, in the current state, very few people who are actually accredited to or trained to accredit this standard. But I would expect that to grow, and it could potentially be a cost to your organization, and something just to watch out for. That said, I do think that there is a reputational benefit to be had to be able to say that you are complying with the ISO 37301 standard. So very important to consider those sort of issues as you're moving forward into this area. And you may well be moving from 19600, so it's not going to be a huge change for organizations, understanding what their management system looks like, but understand that that is now going to be something that can be accredited and therefore certified. I think this is a really interesting area, and there's a lot of discussion, I think, in the industry about, what's the value of that, and how do we actually operate in an environment where some people may be certified and some others aren't. Interestingly, I was reading a post over the last couple of days from the CIO at Grant Thornton in Australia, who noting that, he's probably not going to be very popular for this post, but talking about the recent data leaks and hacking that we've had at both Optus, our telecommunications provider, and Medibank Private, our health insurer. And I think the Medibank Private one has been, quite damaging because a lot of people's health information has been released. And anyway, so Andrew Pritchard, the CIO at Grant Thornton, noted that whilst Medibank Private and Optus both certify that they are ISO 27001 certified, their compliance policies have not prevented this from happening. So he says, while compliance and policies are good tools, they are just that, tools. They offer the structure, but not guaranteed protection. And so I think we need to look at the new standard for compliance through that same lens. Here is a tool, a framework, something which we can operate on and communicate, but it's going to come down to the way that we think about compliance in our organization and the way that we implement it. And ultimately, it'll come down to that culture that we're trying to develop and the training that we give our staff and so on. What messaging are we giving? How are we monitoring that? How are we improving our processes over time? And yes, it's all very well to have something signed off early in the piece and go from there and say, this is, we are accredited, but we need to make sure that we're continuing to maintain that compliance. One thing that is pointed out, and I think this goes through the guidance from a number of regulators, is around the risk-based approach and that scale and applicability. Certainly different organizations will need to look at compliance through the lens that is, available to their business, depending on your size, depending on your industry, and so on. It is important to make sure that you have an approach that is balanced. Certainly a large organization with 20,000 staff and operating in multiple jurisdictions is going to have a much more complex approach. And this risk-based approach also applies when we think about the sort of tools and the components of our compliance management system. And we'll come to a few of those later. I said that this is an approach that is being endorsed by regulators, certainly across our region, and in Australia we have Austrac, who's our anti-money laundering regulator, and they highly advocate this approach. They need people to be looking at what is the right balance in their organization, what products are they producing, where is the risk, what sort of customers are they dealing with, what jurisdictions are they operating in, and so on. So you need to understand what that risk is, determine that risk profile, implement those effective controls, and then balance off that residual risk. You're never going to cover off on everything. Otherwise, you'd spend all of your efforts on compliance and none on actually making money for your organization. The risk-based approach can't work in isolation. It does need to work with the other components of your compliance management system, in particular that senior management oversight and staff training and the communications. So think about that when you're looking at the balance in your organization and how you can apply that risk-based approach. If we're going to have a risk-based approach, we need to be able to do effective risk assessments. And this is enshrined in the standard and is also picked up in other guidance that we're getting from the Department of Justice out of the US and so on. Certainly, some of the organizations that we're talking to are very keen to run risk assessments, maybe across specific areas of risk, but I think it can be done across all areas within your organization. And so, it's a very simple process. When you look at it, we're identifying the risk, we're assessing those risks, we're controlling those risks, we're recording our findings and reviewing those controls. And it goes in that sort of a loop. And you might do that on an annual basis or a biannual basis, depending on how high a risk you have in a particular area. So that sounds relatively simple, but some of these areas are very, very complex, and they have increasing complexity when we start to move in multi-jurisdictional frameworks and so on. I've popped up a link there to Arctic Intelligence, who's a business that we've done some work with over the past, and they have some very effective risk assessment technology, and certainly something that you can look at. And they've got a great benchmarking report that you can download from their site. The second area that I think warrants some deep thinking is around obligations registers. There's so much that every organization needs to comply with these days, whether it be regulation, legislation, and so on, or it could even be just internal policies. There was some figures out of Deloitte that said that about 11% of people employed in most organizations were involved in compliance roles. That's a huge number. And so we need to understand, what is our approach and how do we risk rate those obligations. I've popped up a link there to the LexisNexis guys, and they do some fantastic work in providing you with that list of obligations for your industry. And they cross a range of industries. I know they do healthcare, aged care, occupational health and safety, they do financial services and so on. So I do think it's worth having a look at their product. But there is only so far you can go. I mean, it might be that you look at the top 100 obligations, the top 200 obligations or so on. You've got to take that risk-based approach, because otherwise you're going to tie yourself up in knots. I also think that you need to be aware of the task of mapping those obligations to the individual job roles in your organization. And you can do this via your risk management platform. And I saw David had a couple of the sponsors at the beginning there who both who all have those sort of processes within their risk management systems. But that's where you start to combine the information you're getting out of a service, or you may have developed your own obligations list and map that to the individuals within your organization. And I do that on a job roles basis rather than an individual, because you're always going to get that change in staff and people moving on and so on. So certainly something to look at, and there's a lot of work that can be done there. Again, I would put that risk assessment over the top and say, well, where do we need to actually go? How deep can we go? And what's viable for our size of business? The other area that the standards are picking up is around whistleblowing. And this is increasingly being talked about across the world. And often we think about US organizations and, the big bounties that they provide to whistleblowers. But I think that's an extreme. I think what we're seeing in organizations across our region where we don't have those bounties and bonuses is still an ethical decision-making from people, our stakeholders, our employees, and so on, to report their concerns, and that those reported concerns need to be protected from retaliation, and ensure that those are kept confidential. I put up a list there from a whistleblowing service out of Australia, and it really does align with what is being put out in the ISO standard, the Department of Justice, and some other organizations. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange has actually amended their listing rules, and part of that is to include areas of ESG and establish and maintain appropriate and effective risk management internal control systems. A lot of that is guidance. However, of note that whistleblowing and anti-corruption policies and systems are now a provision rather than just best practice. So if you're listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, you need to have a whistleblowing system in place, and it needs to comply with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange rules. So I think you'll see that this is a trend that's going to be picked up by other governments, other listing organizations, and so on. It may be that your customers are asking, do you have a program in place, and so on. We're certainly seeing those contractual requirements coming through in areas like modern slavery, where if we're supplying an organization, they want us to attest that we have a modern slavery policy in place, a whistleblowing policy in place, and so on, and that we also enforce those sort of things on our suppliers as well. So a lot of work to go there. And I think also think about this from a cultural lens. So it's not just something that needs to be applied to your organization. It's not just a framework that you might want to have in place. A risk-based approach, certainly. I mean, a small organization, it may not be an automated system. It may just be identifying people in your organization who are the appropriate people to talk to. But I'd also recommend thinking about it through the cultural lens of your organization and making sure that you have what is increasingly being called a speak-up culture. And many of you may know about Theranos, the company out of the US, who was making pathology machines that were apparently going to revolutionize the way in which blood was tested. And this idea that was brought up by a woman named Elizabeth Holmes was that she was going to be able to do really, really quick blood testing on micro amounts of blood and identify 200 potential illnesses that you may have. It turned out to be a hoax and a fraud. She'd raised millions and millions of dollars from investors, and the whistle was blown by her lab director, Adam Rosendorf. And he spoke very much about the cult-like culture in that organization. When he was hired, there was an insistence on loyalty to Holmes and her other senior management. His decision, as he said, to blow the whistle was based on the risk he felt was posed to the people's health who were using this fake blood testing. He felt that he couldn't, in all conscience, live by this fraud. However, then he almost derailed the whole case by attempting to speak to Holmes prior to a sentencing, because he started to feel guilty. He started to feel that he was breaking the loyalty to her and the organisation, and perhaps not really to her as an individual, but he stated that he felt awful about her children being left without a mother. And so I think this conflict is really interesting, because on the one hand, you've got the guy doing the right thing and blowing the whistle, but then he almost derailed the whole case by, still complying with the culture of the organisation. However, this week she was sentenced to 11 years in jail. Cool. Sorry, back one. The next area I want to talk about is tailored training, and what does that mean? We've seen a lot of guidance from particularly the Department of Justice in the US to provide tailored training that educates and changes culture. And what's important there is to understand, particularly for larger organizations, the practicalities of that. How do you get to a position where you're providing literally thousands of people with a tailored training experience? The guidance is also asking us to undertake and determine who should be doing that training and on what subjects, which I think is a great exercise. We call it a training needs analysis. And certainly it's a good way of identifying which job roles in your organization need to do which training and when do they need to do it and so on. And part of that should be able to tailor those curricula to those employees to ensure that they're not doing training that's irrelevant to their role. From a training point of view, that's important, because people who are asked to do irrelevant training will mentally switch off to it. From a time point of view and a return on investment, there's no point giving people training that's not relevant to their role. So I think it's really important to have a think about those training needs analysis, and where we can take that to give people a more customized experience. The ISO standard is also giving us some guidance there around building training that is appropriate to the job roles, that we're assessing it for effectiveness, that we've got the reporting in place, and that we're reviewing that regularly. And I think that's something that we are able to do now. The technology that we have today is vastly improved to what it was 10 years ago. And certainly we can build out training, and my role in GRC Solutions is to try and lead a team to deal with this from a technological point of view. Can we build the technology that allows for this ease of a customization at scale? One thing I would like to point out is within the ISO standard, there is a lot of talk about extending that training out to other people, other stakeholders within your business. So whether that is suppliers, as I've suggested, around things like modern slavery, or it could be other parties such as volunteers within your organization and so on. So think about those third parties and how do you actually extend that out? And is that something different that you need to provide to those organizations? Here at GRC, we do talk a lot about customization at scale and what the regulators are thinking. And the strategy that we've adopted is around building out training that is able to be cloned very quickly, that can be skinned for an organization very quickly, that is modular in its nature, so we can apply a curricula that's based on job roles and get that out to individuals so they're not doing irrelevant training. They're only doing what's relevant to their own environment, their own job role, and the risk profile that they present to the business. We ensure that that content is centrally maintained and updated, because the law and regulations is constantly changing. But also, if clients and their staff are having to do this training on an annual basis, they want to see something new. Otherwise, we're just not going to capture their attention. And of course, it's so important to have that audit trail so that you can ensure that you know what's happened in your organization, but you've also got the opportunity to improve what's been going on in your organization, improve your training outcomes. The ISO guide also talks about communication and what should we be doing, who should we communicate to, how do we communicate that, and so on. What they ask of us is that we consider all aspects of diversity and potential barriers to communication. They want us to include communications on culture, compliance objectives, and obligations. And there's a whole laundry list of other things that they want to see us communicating with our organization. And I think this also comes back down to culture, is that it shouldn't be something that's slapped on and applied to individuals within the organization. It should be a conversation that is ongoing within our organizations. And so it doesn't sit outside of the normal business. And there's ways in which we can do that using technology, using issues like opportunities like campaign-based micro-learning and so on, to continue that conversation, because without that conversation, we actually don't have the culture of compliance that we're aiming for. So think about how do we communicate and how often we communicate, and are we getting through to the right people in the right way. The ISO standard also looks at what we should be talking to our people about, looking at policies and the implications of non-conformance. What do we do when things go wrong? What do we say to our staff about issues where there have been breaches, and the relation of that compliance policy and the compliance obligations to their role. So it's quite a burden to be having in an organization, particularly if you're not of that size where you can, have these structures in place that apply, across, as we would do in larger organizations. So I do think it's important that there is some time given, maybe at board level, certainly at senior management level, to understanding how do we build that awareness in our organization, and how do we make sure that we're communicating that awareness in a way that is cutting through. The DOJ has similar sort of ideas around, what has senior management done to let employees know about the company's position on misconduct, and what communications have there been generally when an employee is terminated. And I think we can't be afraid of admitting our mistakes. We can't be afraid to, talk about issues that may well be known in our organizations. And I always think back to one of our organizations here in Australia who had a massive sexual harassment issue that involved the CEO. It was covered in all the newspapers and on all sorts of news channels and so on. But that organization refused to incorporate that case into their own training. The flip side of that was Citibank. Citigroup out of the US had an issue where a guy named Gary Foster stole 22 million from them after finding out that one of his subordinates was paid more than him. It was quite an interesting case, given what he bought. He bought apartments with harbour views, and he bought fancy cars and so on with all this money. He was quite open about spending a lot more money than he seemed to earn. And of course, he was caught. Now, Citigroup then incorporated that into their training. And so a lot of the training on fraud in Citigroup will incorporate that case, and really highlights what the outcome is for Gary. He did end up going to jail. I always think back on this to one of my clients asked me once, what do we do if our staff cheat on their e-learning, cheat on their compliance training? And I glibly said, well, just sack a few, but make sure you do it publicly. Make sure everyone knows that they were sacked for that reason. And I still stand by that. Interestingly, many years later, I saw that JP Morgan in New York had done just that. They'd sacked 20 associates for cheating on their compliance training, and it was publicized in all of the New York financial press. Communication doesn't have to be negative, though, and I draw your attention to my friend here, Ronnie, who runs an amazing charity called Oz Harvest. Oz Harvest reclaims food from around Australian restaurants and supermarkets and it gives it away to people who are less privileged. She has built up this organization over many, many years, and a lot of it is very reliant on her communication. And her chosen form of communication is video. She does videos incredibly well, and it's her way of connecting out with the 3,000 volunteers that work with her. There's no way she could have that personal connection without having the technology to deliver that communication. And what that gives her is the ability to inform people very, very quickly. These days, you can shoot a great video on an iPhone and have it published within that morning. And if you put it into a system, you can have it out there with some questions on the end, and it's out there as a piece of micro-learning or a piece of training very, very quickly, getting those communications out to the people who need it in a format in which they will be able to absorb. It's no good having communications that can't be absorbed. And with Ronnie's business, she's got all these volunteers who are out on the road driving trucks and so on. So they will be taking her videos and looking at them on their mobile phones. So think about what is the medium that you are delivering your content through, and how do you get that to the individuals who need to know? And then what data do we need off the back of that? How much reporting do we need, and so on? How do we know that people have absorbed it and understood the information? The DOJ gives a similar sort of guidance. I think, as you can see there, that staff need ongoing access to policy and training, and it can't just be a folder of documents that they sign when they're a new starter. It's got to be ongoing. It's got to have that ongoing communication so that people understand, where do they go to actually find these policies? If I can't remember something, who do I go to? Who do I ask? If I don't understand something, how do I actually get the information I need? You can't be, giving people a whole lot of work in the first week that they sign on and having it live as shelfware that no one ever touches after that. So think about that from an ongoing perspective. We also need to think about how effective our training has been and making sure that we are acting on that. We need to understand, have the employees been tested on what they've learned, and how do we address those who fail or all or a portion of their testing? And often we see this in compliance training, that people say, hey, we've got a pass mark of 80%, and that's great. But what happens to all those people who got the same 20% wrong? You end up with a huge risk in your organization. What's the follow-on and from the analysis of your training reports? So think about how you measure that, and go back to that model that we had at the start from the ISO standard, where we're looking at, okay, we're going to analyze, and then we're going to work on it again. What do we need to improve? So that continuous improvement. Systems these days will give you all sorts of data. Working out how you get that deep dive into that data and what's valuable to you will come down to that risk-based approach. And when we look at it, what we're trying to do is give people the information that's important to their compliance program, and so that they can actually act on that and work out where to triage. Our experience is that a lot of compliance teams are really, really short of resources. They don't have enough people, and they probably never will. And so what we need is to give them better technology and better access to data, so they know where to focus their time and attention, rather than having a generic approach, which means that they're digging in all the wrong areas. The last sort of area that I really want to cover, and it's really covered in a lot of detail, is around culture and leadership. And look, this is a huge topic. It could be a topic of its own for a webinar, really. What the guidance is telling us is not rocket science. We need to understand that they're, where to find that published set of values. People need to be seen to be actively and implementing and abiding by those values. You can't have an organization that has a compliance policy or a compliance training program that the management don't endorse and live and breathe by. We've seen that in the past, where organizations, new starters will come in, and the management team will say, oh, look, here's the cheat sheet for the training, so you can get through that as quickly as possible, or ask someone else to do it on your behalf. The people involved have to really live and breathe it. And what it's really about here is not creating people who can tick these things off in a rote way, but who, when challenged with challenging situations or confusing situations in their organization, where they've developed that sort of muscle memory about how to deal with these things. How do they deal with a decision that might be challenging their ethics or challenging the way that they understand the framework in which they operate from a regulatory point of view. And so it's that muscle memory that I think we need to embed into our teams, is so that they can respond in a really quick and orderly way. And I always think about it as, what we're trying to do is empowering our people to do the right thing by our stakeholders. And once you've empowered them to do so, the decision-making is not difficult. So if we can get them to that position where they understand what are the rules of engagement, what are our policies, what are our procedures, have I been educated on all the regulatory and legislative obligations that we operate in. And so therefore, when I'm faced with a difficult decision, I have that muscle memory to be able to act and respond in a really positive way. That culture is something that has been a huge topic of conversation. People talk about, how do I measure culture? People talking about how do I implement systems and now allow me to measure that culture? It's really amorphous, right? But you know it when it's there. You know when a good culture is there. You know when it's a bad culture. And so what the standards merely do is give us some guidance as to what should be in our systems to ensure that we've got the right processes to build that culture. And I go back to my book on Built to Last and say, well, it's the same sort of ideas. Are we giving people all the information? Are we treating them in a fair and equitable way? Is the culture that we have internally, is that something that we reflect externally? And I think that's incredibly important when we think about the way we operate in business. Are we treating ourselves in the same way that we'd want to treat our clients? Or, the old cliche is, would you want to sell this product to your grandmother? So thinking about that as far as building our own internal culture. Part of that is also going back to the previous slides around, what happens if there is a breach? What do we do about that? How do we own up to it? And what are the repercussions for individuals? And certainly there's a lot of conversation on that topic around, what's happening as far as individual responsibility for particular areas within an organization. So the new standard places increased emphasis on the role of managers at all levels in ensuring compliance. And that's part of the certification, that there must be a structure in place to promote compliance and have actual responsibilities pinned to particular managers. That's a theme that's going through organizations as well. And I know in New Zealand, there's been some discussion around senior management responsibility. I'm not sure if there's legislation going through. In the States, very much, you can see from the Department of Justice here, the department's number one priority is individual accountability. In the UK, we have the same idea around from the FCA around senior manager accountability regimes. And look, I thought this was all really, good stuff. I thought that's exactly what we need, particularly off the back of, some of the major fines that we'd had in Australia. When I heard about, particularly the Westpac fine, I thought, this is particularly unfair on the shareholders. $1.3 billion fine for things that were, the actions of the staff, not necessarily the shareholders. So who was penalized? Interestingly, I was wrong. When it actually came down to it, the share price went up once the fine was announced, because the markets had actually already decided that was okay. That 1.3 billion compared to their profit wasn't a huge amount, and it could have been a lot worse. So the shareholders didn't do too badly out of it, and everyone seems to have moved on. So the question really is, what is the value of those fines? And certainly there's been, questions from the market, saying it's hard to see how fines are a deterrent. if the job of the board and the senior management is to serve the interests of the shareholders, what doesn't matter to investors won't matter much to the board either. And that's a quote from an analyst from Morningstar. So there is this increasing push for accountability regimes. In Australia, we brought in the BEAR, which was better than what was going to be called the Senior Management Executive Accountability Regime, or SMEAR. But the BEAR was brought in, and a lot of work went into building out those structures and having those accountability regimes in. I think that has been received relatively positively, and now our regulators are moving on to extend that out into other regulated entities. And as I said, we'll be sharing those slides. But I think, it's all very well to build in those frameworks and so on. But at the end of the day, it does actually come down to culture. And recognizing that we're sort of almost on time now, I just want to remind people of this particular video, which is available on YouTube, which comes from the Australian Army, Lieutenant General David Morrison, when talking about what was a pretty horrendous situation within the military to do with a group of people creating some pretty awful videos. And the quote from that, and it's a 3-minute video, so it's well worth watching, is that the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And I think if we have that as a sort of guide in our culture, when we're building out our culture, that we talk about what is it that we are prepared to accept? What is it that we're prepared to ignore? What is it that we're prepared to pass over? And are we happy to have that reflected out to, the stakeholders in our organizations? So look, I hope that that's been valuable to you. David, I don't know if you want to show that video or just share it with people later.
Thanks, Julian. I think we'll share it with people later, and we'll take some time for questions now, if you want to go there now, Julian.
Yeah, happy to. Yep. Thank you.
Great. Look, great presentation, and look, I was really interested in especially like the mapping obligations and the tailoring the training. I think that's extremely relevant. And look, if anyone's got any questions, and please take the opportunity now. Please let us know. Just put it into the chat there. Julian, just while we were seeing if there's any questions coming up, I just wondered kind of what traction you're getting around the organisations now with your kind of view and scope on that compliance and organisational culture. Is there good uptake of actually people thinking outside a little bit?
Yes, there is. And I think what we've found quite interesting is the breadth of organisations that are now looking at these areas. So we've traditionally worked in regulated industries, mining, manufacturing, those sort of organisations, FMCG. We have a strong presence in financial services. But what's been interesting over the last 18 months or so is that we're now working with a lot of community groups, care groups, obviously aged care in the home is a really big issue in Australia, but also in the secondary education space. So a lot of schools have pretty extensive compliance requirements for teachers and staff and volunteers, and we're really only sort of getting into that market at the moment, but we're finding that there's a huge appetite in those organisations. And look, we've come off the back of a few inquiries that have not shown things to be operating in a great light. But it is good to see that there is this sort of framework, because I find that once you've got the right culture in place, the teams who are having to operate in that structure are much more comfortable. It's where you don't have that framework, you don't have that guidance, that people feel, I'm not sure how to operate here. And that's where I come back to that idea of, how do we empower our people to do the right thing by our stakeholders? So the eye opener for us is in that area, that other market.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julian. Look, I'm thinking, being ex-Australian over myself and knowing David Morrison a little bit, I think let's play that video. There's no questions at this stage, and if there is, we can go back to it.
Okay. Oh, is that coming through? No. I'm not sure that we got audio there. No, it doesn't look like we've got audio coming through the Zoom.
That's okay. Let's work on that. We can always send it out later.
Yeah, look, the link is there, and it's certainly something, not only is it powerful because he stares down the barrel of the camera and looks very seriously at you, but he's covering an incredibly serious topic in some very plain language. And I think that goes to, some of the things I've been saying about understanding the medium which you're going to communicate, and who you're communicating to. This wasn't a video that was just released internally. This was, a case that was well known in Australia. It was being covered in the press. So by putting it out on YouTube, it got news coverage. It got, general public were looking at it. So it wasn't just that the military themselves were getting this message. He was sending a message to the whole Australian public about it. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. And that's where I think, thinking about the message is really important. We've done some work in the past. We worked with the New South Wales Police Force, looking at areas around privacy and, what they can and can't do, health privacy and those sort of issues, because they have some specific risks that they need to understand. And, things like if they've arrested someone who's bleeding, can they share health information about that individual with someone who might have to take control of that individual? Or if they know someone's got a mental health issue, can they give them back their gun when they come back to work, that sort of thing. And so we integrated, some video messaging from the police commissioner into their training programs, and, did face-to-face training for the senior brass, and then rolled out online training with the videos to about 27,000 police across New South Wales. And it's a very powerful way of doing things, to get that messaging in. And it's that tone at the top, right? We all talk about tone at the top, action at the middle. How do we get that tone at the top? Well, you've got to have that messaging right, and you've got to incorporate it in, your policies, your procedures, your training, and all your other communications. And I think that's really where all of the standards, all the guidance we're getting is leading us, that we have that consistent messaging.
Oh, very much, Julian. And look, I think it was a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. Gave me a lot to think about, and I'm sure a lot of the members as well. And it'd be great to send it out after this so they can recap and also have a look at that video. So, look, I just want to say a big thank you, Julian, for the presentation. We've all learned a lot today, and thanks for everyone for making the time to join us for this lunchtime seminar. I think we've just got one more to go for this year. This webinar has been recorded and will be sent out in the next couple of days. And look, if you aren't already a member of Risk New Zealand, please consider it. We'd love to have you as a member and join us. So just please get in touch anytime. And thanks for being here, and we'll see you at the next one. And have a great week. Thank you very much, Julian. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you for having me.